Hi, I'm Emily from the Economics Tutoring Center, and today we're going to do some problems on calculating GDP. Just so you know, different teachers use different notation, so be sure to check with your professor before you use or implement any of these exact methods. Alright, continuing on with our calculations of GDP and understanding of how it's influenced, we're going to do a few different examples. So, I'm going to go ahead and write out the equation. GDP equals C, consumption, plus G, government, plus I, investment, plus X for net exports. So in this first scenario, Debbie spends $300 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. What happens to GDP? Alright, so she spent money on a final good or service that occurred in this year because they just went out and they had dinner. So what does this sound like? Well, it's not government spending, and it's happening in Boston, so she's not importing or exporting anything, nor is she investing in anything or keeping something in inventory. So, as was probably obvious to you in the beginning, this is a consumption. So if Debbie is spending $300 to buy her husband dinner, then we have increased our consumption by $300. And by doing that, we've increased our GDP by $300. And that's it for this question. As we move to the second example, I've already put the equation for GDP down here at the bottom. Sarah spends $1,200 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. What will happen to GDP? All right, well, if she's spending $1,200, we might think that, like in that previous example where we were spending money and it was counting as consumption, that this $1,200 would be Sarah's consumption. However, we have to look at what she's using it for, and she's using it in her publishing business. And so because of that, we're going to look at that as investment because she's investing into her business. So we have an increase in investment here for $1,200. But then what happened? The laptop was built in China. And if we remember the definition of GDP, it's only the final goods and services that were created or produced in this country. And so when something is imported or exported from a different nation, we have to use this portion of the equation, net exports. Now, we can break this equation down into make it a little bit simpler and easier to understand. And so this equation can be broken down to be net exports are equal to our exports, so what we're exporting from the U.S. or whatever country we're calculating the GDP of, minus our imports. So the laptop was built in China. Is this going to be an export or an import? Well, if we brought it here, it's going to be an import, and so therefore our net exports, since we're subtracting our imports out, you see this here, how we're subtracting imports, our net exports are going to decrease by $1,200. And so if we have an increase in investment over here, but a decrease because it was imported into this country and therefore was part of China's GDP. Then we have GDP has changed by adding 1,200 and then subtracting 1,200. So that's a change of $0, so it has remained constant. So the answer to this question would be that GDP remains constant. In this next scenario, Jane spends $800 on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on a sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. What will happen to GDP? All right, so if she's using it in her editing business, we would assume that this was going to be an investment, just like in this last scenario where the girl was buying the computer for her publishing company. However, there's another really important factor in this question that we have to pay attention to. She got last year's model, and GDP is the final goods and services produced in this country in this year. And so this, because it was last year's model, would not be included in GDP at all. So there's absolutely no change in GDP. So there's no change in the GDP of this year. And that's because if it was last year's model, it's not included in this year. It was produced last year and then kept as inventory. So if we were looking at last year, it would have been included in the investment portion because that $800 computer was the inventory of last year's GDP. But the question's asking about this year, so no change. All right, and for one final example, General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy $470 million worth of them. What will happen to GDP? All right, so consumers buy $470 million worth of them. Well, that's pretty obvious what part of GDP that ends up in because consumers we typically associate with consumption. So our consumption is increasing by $470 million because we have bought $470 million worth of cars. However, GM built $500 million worth of them. So there's an extra amount of cars left over. We had in total 500 million, and we subtract our consumption, 470 million. And what was General Motors left over with? They were left over with $30 million worth of cars that they produced in this year. And so because they produced them in this year, but no one bought them, we still include them in GDP. We just don't include them under consumption. We instead include them under investment because our gross investment includes our unsold inventory for this year. So $30 million of those cars went unsold. So if GDP is increasing by $470 million in consumption and $30 million in investment, we have a total GDP change of an increase in $470 million plus an increase in $30 million, which equals an increase in $500 million. So although it might seem that we could have just added in this $500 million worth of cars at the very beginning, it's important that we realize that we need to separate this 500 into 470 and 30 because consumption and investment are two very different portions of GDP. So although our final GDP changed the same amount, the steps we took to get there, they can be very helpful in addressing further problems.
And that's all for today. If you need any more help, feel free to come to the Economics Tutoring Center on the second floor of the BA building. I hope this was very helpful. Bye.